to rise up voices from the front lines, your window into relationship, identity, safety, emotional awareness, regulation and intelligence, unleashed potential, passion and purpose.
Hello, everybody. Today's episode is called The Bloodstained Microphone, Leadership in an Age of Outrage, Influence, and Uncertainty. And today's episode is a little longer, so I've broken it into chapters for you so you can start and stop where it fits for you. Chapter 1, The Other Trial. In a world where anyone can pick up a microphone, what responsibility do we have for the consequences of our influence? Over the course of my career, I've learned something fascinating about human beings. The most dangerous moments are rarely the moments when people disagree. The most dangerous moments are the moments when people become absolutely convinced that they're right. I've seen it in disaster zones. I've seen it in organizations and marriages, especially those headed towards divorce. And I've seen it in community conflicts, criminal investigations, and critical incidents where emotions were running so high that people could no longer distinguish between what they knew and what they believed. The human mind does something really remarkable under distress. It seeks certainty. From a neurological perspective, certainty feels safe. Uncertainty feels threatening. The problem is that life rarely offers certainty during the moments when we want it the most. When a child goes missing, people want answers right now. When a disaster strikes, people want someone to blame immediately. When a tragedy unfolds in public view, communities begin searching for certainty long before all the facts have been gathered. The need is understanding. The consequences of this rush can be devastating. And as I sit down to record this episode, our nation is once again finding itself divided by a highly publicized criminal case. Social media feeds are filled with commentary, news outlets are competing for attention, communities are arguing, protests are forming, and people are choosing sides. The courtroom may be the place where legal decisions are made, but another trial is already underway. A trial in the court of public opinion. And unlike a courtroom, the court of public opinion rarely waits for all the evidence. It moves at the speed of emotion. That reality should concern every single one of us. Not because people care. Caring is never the problem. Not because people are passionate. Passion's not the problem. The problem arises when emotions begin to replace investigation, when assumptions begin to replace evidence, and when outrage replaces thoughtful consideration. Because history teaches us a difficult lesson. Human beings are capable of incredible acts of destruction when they're united by fear, anger, or certainty that's untethered by truth. The same crowd that can march for justice becomes a mob. The same movement that can create meaningful change creates collateral damage. The same voice that can inspire healing can ignite a fire that spreads far beyond its intended target. And this is why leadership matters. Not leadership in the traditional sense of titles, positions, authority, or organizational charts. I'm talking about the kind of leadership that emerges whenever a person decides to pick up the microphone and influence what other people think, feel, or do. Because whether we realize it or not, every one of us now holds a microphone. Every social media account is a microphone. Every podcast, a microphone. Every comment section is a microphone. Every conversation around a dinner table becomes a microphone. The question is not whether we have influence. The question is whether we understand the responsibility that comes with it. And that responsibility becomes infinitely more important during moments when entire communities are emotionally activated at the same time. Because when emotions rise, thinking changes. When thinking changes, decisions change. And when decisions change, lives can be changed forever. Chapter 2, the Bloodstained Microphone. One of the most important lessons that I've learned throughout my career is that leadership is never measured by how many people listen to you. It's measured by what happens after they do. And that may sound like a simplistic distinction, but it changes everything. For most of human history, the ability to influence large numbers of people was reserved for a select few: politicians, religious leaders, military commanders, journalists, and community organizers. They all held the microphone. They had access to platforms, those that were capable of shaping public opinion, directing behavior, and influencing the course of events. Today, that reality has changed. Technology has placed a microphone into nearly every hand on the planet. Every social media account has the potential to reach thousands, maybe millions. Every podcast has the potential to influence minds. Every video has the potential to shape beliefs. Every post has the potential to mobilize people towards action. Many people celebrate this reality as a victory for free speech, and in many ways it is. Voices that would have once been ignored can now be heard. Communities can organize. Information can travel rapidly. Injustices can be exposed. But every gift carries responsibility. The ability to influence others has always come with consequences. The challenge is that modern culture tends to focus almost exclusively on the right to speak while paying very little attention to the responsibility that accompanies being heard. This is where I often introduce a concept I call the bloodstained microphone. It is a metaphor, but it's one born from very real experiences. Over the years, I've worked in disaster zones, searched for missing persons, supported families in the aftermath of tragedy, responded to critical incidents, investigated cases involving exploitation and abuse, and stood alongside communities navigating some of the most painful moments of their lives. When you spend enough time in those environments, you begin to recognize a difficult truth. Bad decisions leave bodies behind. Poor leadership leaves casualties. Irresponsible communication creates consequences that can't always be undone. Words are never just words. Ideas are never just ideas. Leadership is never just influence. Every action taken by a leader eventually lands somewhere in the world. It affects a family, a community, a child, a responder, a victim. It affects a future that has not yet been written. And that's why I say that the microphone is bloodstained. Not because speaking is dangerous, although we all know sometimes it is. Not because disagreement is dangerous. Not because free expression is dangerous. The danger emerges when influence becomes disconnected from responsibility. History provides us with countless examples. Some leaders have used their voices to unite divided communities, inspire courage during impossible circumstances, and create movements that expanded freedom, justice, and human dignity. Others have used the same tools to spread fear, hatred, misinformation, and violence. The microphone itself is neutral. The person holding it never is. Neither are the people listening. That reality becomes especially important during moments of public unrest. When emotions are high, people become more suggestible. They become more reactive. They become more likely to accept information that confirms what they already believe and reject information that challenges it. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. Neuroscience describes it as the brain attempting to create certainty in the face of perceived threat. The result is predictable. Nuance disappears. Complexity disappears. Curiosity disappears. And certainty rushes in to fill the void. The problem, of course, is that certainty and truth are not the same thing. In fact, some of the most confident people in history have been catastrophically wrong. Yet confidence is persuasive. Emotion and fear are persuasive. Outrage is persuasive. This is why leadership requires something more than conviction. It requires discipline, humility, and the willingness to remain uncomfortable while evidence is still emerging. Perhaps most importantly, it requires the courage to admit what we don't know yet. That may be one of the rarest forms of leadership in our modern world. We've become extraordinarily comfortable speaking with certainty. We've become remarkably uncomfortable sitting with uncertainty. Yet uncertainty is where truth often lives while it's still being discovered. As communities across the nation wrestle with difficult questions, strong emotions, and deeply held beliefs, I find myself returning to the same thought again and again. Before we pick up the microphone, before we amplify the narrative, before we join a movement, before we condemn, defend, accuse, or celebrate, we should pause long enough to ask a simple question. What will happen if I'm wrong? Because leadership is not measured by the volume of your voice. It's measured by our willingness to carry the weight of its consequences. Chapter 3. When outrage feels like certainty. One of the greatest misconceptions in modern society is the belief that strong emotions make us irrational. They don't. At least not immediately. What they do is something far more subtle and in many ways far more dangerous. They change the way we process information. This is one of the reasons I've spent so much of my career studying trauma, crisis response, human behavior, and the nervous system. Because whether I'm working with military personnel, first responders, organizational leaders, survivors of trauma, families in crisis, or communities recovering from disaster, I'm ultimately observing the same human operating system. The circumstances change, the biology never does. Human beings are wired for survival. Long before we developed sophisticated reasoning, philosophy, politics, social media, or legal systems, we developed the ability to rapidly assess danger. That survival mechanism is one of the reasons our species still exists today. It's also one of the reasons entire communities can become divided during emotionally charged events. When the brain perceives a threat, whether physical, emotional, social, financial, or ideological, it begins prioritizing survival over exploration. Certainty becomes more valuable than curiosity. Immediate action feels safer than patient investigation. The nervous system starts looking for answers, patterns, and conclusions that will reduce uncertainty as quickly as possible. The challenge is that reducing uncertainty and discovering truth are not always the same thing. In fact, they're often very different processes. Truth requires patience. Survival demands speed. Truth asks questions. Survival seeks conclusions. Truth loves complexity. Survival demands simplicity. And when large numbers of people are experiencing the same emotional activation simultaneously, something fascinating begins to happen. The nervous system becomes contagious. We often think of emotions as private experiences, but they are remarkably social. Human beings constantly mirror one another. We mirror facial expressions. We mirror body language. We mirror tone of voice. We mirror emotional states. This process happens so naturally that most people never notice it. Walk into a room full of laughter and you feel lighter. Walk into a room full of tension and your shoulders tighten before you consciously even understand why. If you spend enough time around anxious people, your anxiety rises. If you spend enough time around angry people, your own frustration begins to grow. The nervous system is consistently asking simple questions. How safe am I right now? And one of the ways it answers that question is by observing the emotional states of the people around us. Now imagine what happens when millions of people are connected through 24-hour news cycles, social media algorithms, live streams, podcasts, comment sections, and viral propaganda content. We're no longer influenced by the emotional state of the room. We're influenced by the emotional state of entire communities, regions, nations, movements. The result is what psychologists often refer to as emotional contagion and group polarization. As people gather around their shared beliefs, shared fears, or shared frustrations, those emotions begin reinforcing one another. Moderate opinions often become stronger. Strong opinions become more rigid, and nuanced conversations become increasingly difficult. People begin sorting themselves into teams because humans seek belonging. One of the most powerful forces in human psychology is the desire to belong to a group. From an evolutionary perspective, belonging increased survival. Isolation made us vulnerable. Being accepted by the tribe matters because the tribe often determines whether you live or die. That ancient wiring still exists inside every one of us today. The only thing that has changed is the tribe. Today, the tribe may be political, ideological, cultural. It may exist entirely online, but the nervous system responds in much the same way. Once we identify with a group, information that supports the group feels safer. Information that threatens the group feels dangerous. We become more likely to defend our side and more likely to scrutinize the other side. This is just how humans work. The problem arises when we stop recognizing it. The moment that we become convinced that bias exists only in other people is usually the moment that our own bias becomes most dangerous. One of the most humbling lessons I've learned throughout my career is that intelligent people are not immune to bias. Educated people are not immune to bias. Experienced people are not immune to bias. Leaders are not immune. In fact, highly intelligent people often become exceptionally skilled at defending conclusions they reached emotionally rather than objectively. They simply use bigger words while they're doing it. That realization should create humility in every single one of us. Because if we're honest, every one of us enters difficult conversations carrying assumptions, experiences, fears, beliefs, values, and emotional reactions. None of us begin from a perfectly neutral position. The goal is not to eliminate our humanity. The goal is to become aware of it, to recognize when our emotions are informing us and when they're driving us, to recognize when we're seeking truth and when we're seeking certainty, to recognize when we are asking questions and when we're merely collecting evidence for conclusions that we've already reached. This is where leadership begins to separate itself from activism. Activism often begins with a conclusion. Leadership begins with an investigation. Activism asks, how do I advance my position? Leadership asks, what is true? Those questions are not always compatible. And during moments of public unrest, that distinction matters enormously. Because when outrage begins to feel like certainty, communities become vulnerable to making decisions that cannot be undone. History is filled with examples of people who later wish they had slowed down, who wish they had asked more questions, who wish they had examined more evidence, who wish they had resisted the pressure to choose a side before they understood the situation. The challenge, of course, is that slowing down feels uncomfortable, especially when emotions are high, especially when people are suffering, especially when everyone around you seems absolutely certain. But leadership has never been about doing what is comfortable. Leadership is the willingness to remain disciplined while everyone else is rushing. Leadership is the willingness to remain curious while everyone else is concluding. Leadership is the willingness to pursue truth even when the truth may ultimately challenge your own assumptions. And that's precisely why the next step matters so much. Because once we understand what outrage does to the brain, we can begin asking a far more important question. If certainty is not our compass, what should guide us instead? And that weight is far heavier than most people realize. Section 4. Justice, vengeance, and the search for truth. If certainty is not our compass, then what guides us? I would argue that the answer is truth. Not comfort, not popularity, not politics, not public opinion. Truth. That sounds simple until you realize how difficult it becomes when emotions are involved. One of the most challenging realities of working in trauma, crisis, and critical incident response is learning that pain creates urgency. When people are hurting, they want answers. When people are grieving, they want accountability. When people feel afraid, they want safety. And when communities experience tragedy, they often want all of those things immediately. And that desire is completely understandable. It's also where we get ourselves into trouble, because the need for justice and the need for emotional relief are not the same thing. This is a distinction that rarely gets discussed, yet it sits at the center of almost every public conflict we face. Justice seeks truth. Vengeance seeks relief. Justice asks, what happened? What evidence is there? Who was harmed? What is fair? What creates safety moving forward? Vengeance asks a different set of questions. Who can we blame? Who should suffer? Who should pay for our pain? Who will carry the weight of our anger? Both impulses are deeply human. One is focused on resolution. The other is focused on release. The challenge is that release often feels like resolution in the moment. It feels satisfying, powerful. It feels like action. But history repeatedly shows us that actions driven primarily by emotional relief rarely create the outcomes that we hope for. In fact, more often than not, they create entirely new victims. One of the reasons I spend so much time teaching about trauma-informed leadership is because trauma changes the way we experience threat, safety, fairness, and accountability. When people have been harmed, whether individually or collectively, their nervous system naturally begins scanning for danger. It wants reassurance that what happened won't happen again. It wants certainty. It wants protection. It wants someone to take responsibility. And those are healthy and understandable needs. The problem arises when the desire for certainty outruns the evidence available to support it. At that point, people begin filling in the gaps. Assumptions become facts. Rumors become evidence. Opinions become certainty. And before long, entire communities can find themselves defending positions that were never fully investigated in the first place. I've watched this happen in organizations, families, and communities responding to tragedy. And I've watched it happen on a nationwide scale. And I'm watching it happen in real time right now on both a local and international scale. The pattern is remarkably consistent. A painful event occurs. People rush to make sense of it. Narratives emerge. Groups form around those narratives. The narratives harden into identities, and eventually questioning the narrative becomes more threatening than questioning the facts. That's a dangerous play for any community to find itself in, because truth should never be afraid of questions. If a position cannot withstand scrutiny, investigation, and honest inquiry, then it's not a position rooted in truth. It's a position rooted in certainty. And there's a very big difference. As leaders, parents, educators, first responders, community members, and citizens, we have an obligation to recognize that distinction because we care enough to get it right, because real justice matters. Justice isn't strengthened by assumptions or outrage or social pressure. Justice is strengthened when we have the courage to follow evidence wherever it leads, even when that destination is uncomfortable, especially when that destination is uncomfortable. One of the hardest lessons I've learned over the years is that truth does not belong to any tribe. Truth doesn't care at all about our politics. It doesn't care about our preferences. It doesn't care about the outcome that we hoped for. Truth simply is. Our responsibility isn't to create it. Our responsibility is to pursue it. And that pursuit requires something that's become increasingly rare in our culture: humility. The humility to acknowledge what we know, what we don't know, and to allow an investigation to unfold. The humility to change our minds when new information emerges. And perhaps most importantly, the humility to recognize that our desire for justice can sometimes become vulnerable to being hijacked by our desire for certainty. Because the moment that we become more committed to being right than to discovering what is true, we stop serving justice. We start serving ourselves. And those are not the same thing. The question every leader must eventually answer isn't which side am I on? The question is, am I willing to follow the truth even if it challenges my side? Because that's where integrity lives. Chapter 5. Facts first, feelings second, opinions third, action last. Over the years, I've found myself returning to the same framework again and again, whether I'm leading search and rescue operations, supporting organizations through crisis, working with trauma survivors, responding to disasters, or helping leaders navigate difficult decisions. The reason is simple. Human beings do not suddenly become more rational because the stakes become higher. If anything, the opposite tends to happen. When emotions rise, our field of vision narrows. We become more certain, we become more reactive, we become more convinced that immediate action is necessary. And in the moment, it feels responsible, decisive. It feels like leadership. Unfortunately, some of the worst decisions I've ever witnessed were made by intelligent, capable people who confused urgency with wisdom. One of the reasons this lesson matters so much right now is because we're watching it unfold on multiple stages simultaneously. Here in Texas, communities are responding to the Carmelo Anthony trial with powerful emotions and deeply held convictions. Some people see the verdict as justice served. Others see it as evidence of injustice. Some believe the legal process worked exactly as it was intended, while others believe it failed. Entire groups of people are looking at the same case and walking away with radically different conclusions. At the same time, on the international stage, the world is watching the escalating conflict between Israel and Iran. Entire nations are debating who is right, who is wrong, who started it, who should respond, and what justice should look like moving forward. Families are grieving, communities are afraid, political leaders are under enormous pressure. The stakes could not be higher. What fascinates me is that while these situations are vastly different in scale, the human psychology underneath them is remarkably similar. In both situations, people are trying to answer the same fundamental questions. What happened? Who's responsible? Who was harmed? What should happen next? The challenge is that most people attempt to answer those questions in the wrong order. They begin with action. They begin with judgment. They begin with conclusions. Then they search for evidence that supports whatever conclusion they've already reached. This is not a political problem. It's a human problem. And it's precisely why I developed a framework that I've relied on throughout my career. Facts first. Feelings second. Options third. And actions last. The order matters. In fact, I would argue that the order can be the difference between leadership and reaction. Facts come first because reality matters. Before I can make a decision, before I can take a position, before I can tell other people what I believe should happen, I need to understand what is actually known, not what is suspected, not what is rumored, not what I hope is true or fear is true, what is actually supported by evidence. What information do we have? What information do we not have? What questions remain unanswered? Because what we don't know is often more important than what we do. And that might sound obvious, but it is astonishing how often people skip through these steps. In trauma work, we see this all the time. The human brain hates uncertainty, and faced with incomplete information, it fills in the blanks and creates stories. It makes assumptions and draws conclusions. And sometimes those conclusions are correct. And often they're wildly inaccurate. The problem is that certainty feels exactly the same either way. After facts come feelings. This is the step many people misunderstand. Trauma-informed leadership doesn't ask us to ignore our emotions. It asks us to acknowledge them honestly without allowing them to become the sole driver of our decisions. Fear, grief, anger, confusion, all of those are important. All of those matter. They contain valuable information about how people are experiencing an event. They tell us where trust has been broken, where pain exists, where people feel unsafe, and where support is needed. Ignoring those emotions creates its own set of problems. Yet treating emotions as evidence creates an entirely different set of problems. A feeling can be completely valid and still not be fact. That distinction is one of the most important leadership skills that any person can develop, because only after we understand the facts and acknowledge the feelings do we move into options. This is where curiosity becomes incredibly valuable. What responses are available? What solutions exist? What have we not considered? What second and third order consequences might emerge from each decision? What fires might we accidentally ignite in our effort to put out another one? This is where leadership slows down long enough to think. Not because leaders are weak or indecisive, but because leaders understand that consequences don't care about intentions. And only after we've worked through facts, feelings, and options do we arrive at action. The truth is that most people reverse the process. They act first, justify second, and defend third, and then spend years living with consequences they never anticipated. Leadership asks something harder of us. It asks us to pause, to investigate, to remain curious, to tolerate uncertainty a little longer than everyone else. And perhaps most importantly, it asks us to have the courage to change our minds when new information emerges. Because leadership is not about being the first person to react. Leadership is about being disciplined enough to respond wisely. In moments like these, whether we're talking about a criminal trial, a community conflict, or a geopolitical crisis that could impact millions of lives, that discipline may be one of the most valuable things we have to offer. Not certainty, not outrage, not ideology, discipline. Because truth has never been threatened by careful investigation. Only false certainty fears being examined. And integrity has always been the price of real leadership. So, who handed them the microphone? There's another challenge that I want to talk about if we're going to have an honest conversation about leadership in this modern world. For most of human history, leadership came with some kind of barrier to entry. That wasn't always a good thing. Sometimes important voices were excluded. Sometimes power structures protected themselves. Sometimes the gatekeepers became the problem. There are countless examples throughout history where the people challenging the system were ultimately proven right. But there's also a benefit to those barriers. In most environments where lives, livelihoods, safety, or significant consequences were involved, people were expected to demonstrate a certain level of competence before they were given authority and influence. If you want to fly an airplane, there are prerequisites. If you want to become a surgeon, there are prerequisites. If you want to lead military personnel into combat, there are prerequisites. If you want to work a critical incident, investigate a crime, command a disaster response, or manage a large organization, there are prerequisites. Someone somewhere eventually asks a very reasonable question. How do we know this person is qualified to be responsible for the outcomes they create? And the strange reality of our current culture is that we've almost completely abandoned that question when it comes to public influence. Today, a person can build an audience of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of people without ever demonstrating emotional regulation, critical thinking, leadership ability, expertise, integrity, or accountability, or even a basic understanding of the issue they're discussing. And before anyone misunderstands me, I am not arguing against free speech. I believe deeply in free speech. What concerns me is something different. Influence has become democratized, while responsibility hasn't. The result is that many of the people shaping public opinion are not necessarily the people best equipped to do so. They're simply the people who figured out how to capture attention. And as someone who studies human behavior, I find this fascinating. And as someone who studies crisis, I find it terrifying. Because attention and leadership are not even close to the same thing. Attention and wisdom are not the same thing. Attention and character are not the same thing. Attention and competence are certainly not the same thing. Yet our nervous systems often respond as if they are. Human beings are naturally drawn to confidence. We're drawn toward that certainty. We're drawn towards people who appear convinced of their position. And during moments of uncertainty, that pull becomes even stronger because confidence feels like safety. You can see it everywhere right now. People are searching for voices that tell them exactly what happened in the Carmelo Anthony case. People are searching for voices that explain the conflict between Israel and Iran. People are searching for someone who can simplify incredibly complex situations into a clear narrative that allows them to feel certain again. The problem is that the people most willing to provide simple answers are often the people who are the least qualified to provide them. Complex situations require nuance. Nuance is not particularly popular. Nuance doesn't trend or go viral or generate outrage clicks. Nuance doesn't fit neatly into a 30-second video clip or a social media meme. What spreads is certainty, outrage, fear, and tribalism. And those things activate the nervous system. And activated people pay attention. Unfortunately, the qualities that make someone influential are not the same qualities that make someone trustworthy. Some of the wisest leaders I've ever met were incredibly cautious about speaking before they understood the full picture. They asked difficult questions. They considered second and third order consequences. They challenged their own assumptions. They were willing to admit what they didn't know. And ironically, that kind of humility often makes people appear less certain and therefore less appealing than someone making bold declarations from a place of limited information. The danger is that we begin confusing visibility with credibility. We begin confusing popularity with expertise. We begin confusing confidence with competence. And before long, entire communities are being led by individuals who have never demonstrated the qualities that we would demand in any other position of responsibility. Imagine selecting a surgeon based on follower count. Imagine choosing a pilot because their videos received the most engagement. Imagine placing someone in charge of a disaster response because they were the loudest person in the room. Most people immediately recognize how absurd this sounds. Yet every day we allow those same standards to shape our opinions about justice, public policy, leadership, social movements, and international affairs. The challenge facing our society is not that everyone has a voice. The challenge is that very few people have been taught how to evaluate who deserves their trust. And perhaps one of the most important leadership skills of the next generation will not be learning how to gain influence. It will be learning how to evaluate influence, learning how to ask better questions, learning how to distinguish wisdom from charisma, learning how to distinguish competence from confidence, learning how to distinguish truth from certainty. Because every movement eventually takes on the character of the people leading it. And before we follow someone simply because they picked up the microphone, we should probably spend some time asking whether they have demonstrated the judgment, integrity, humility, and responsibility necessary to be trusted with it. Not every person who's willing to lead is prepared to carry the consequences of leadership. History has shown us that lesson repeatedly. The fires that we light. One of the privileges of spending years in search and rescue, disaster response, crisis intervention, and community recovery is that you begin to see patterns. At first, those patterns seem unrelated. A flood is not a wildfire. A missing child is not an organizational crisis. A community conflict is not an international incident. Yet after enough years standing in the aftermath of human suffering, you begin to notice that many of the same principles show up over and over again. One of those principles is fire. Most people think fire is the disaster. It isn't. The disaster occurs when the fire grows beyond our ability to control it. In fact, fire itself is neither good nor bad. Fire heats our homes, cooks our food. It can clear dead brush from a forest floor and create the conditions necessary for new growth. Entire ecosystems depend upon it. The same force that can sustain life can also destroy everything in its path. The difference is rarely the flame. The difference is whether someone understood the power of what they were handling. And I think about that often when I watch social movements unfold. I think about it when I watch communities respond to tragedy. I think about it when I see people gathering around causes, movements, political positions, or cultural conflicts. Because the truth is that movements and fires have far more in common than most people realize. Every movement begins with energy. It begins with emotion. It begins with the belief that something is wrong and that something needs to change. Sometimes that belief is absolutely justified. In fact, some of the most important advances in human history occurred because ordinary people refused to remain silent in the face of injustice. Progress often begins when someone's willing to challenge the status quo. The desire for change is not the danger. The danger emerges when the emotional energy driving the movement becomes disconnected from responsibility. And one of the things that concerns me about our current culture is that we've become exceptionally good at ignition and increasingly poor at containment. We celebrate the person who starts the conversation, the person who gathers the crowd, the person who creates the viral moment, the person who says the thing that nobody else was willing to say. We reward outrage with attention. We reward certainty with applause. We reward emotional activation with visibility. But what we rarely reward is restraint. What we rarely reward is thoughtful consideration. What we rarely reward is the person asking what happens next. And that question matters more than most people realize. What happens after the crowd gathers? What happens after the social media post reaches millions of people? What happens after the protest, after the verdict, after the retaliation? What happens after the military response? What happens after the emotional release has passed? Because consequences have a way of arriving long after the excitement is gone. And one of the things that disaster work teaches you very quickly is that someone always has to deal with the aftermath. Someone always has to help families rebuild. Someone always has to search through the debris. Someone always has to repair the damage. Someone always has to pick up the pieces after the people who created the chaos have moved on to the next headline. That reality has profoundly shaped the way that I think about leadership. I've become less interested in the people who know how to start fires and more interested in the people who understand how to manage them. Anyone can create outrage. Anyone can provoke an emotional reaction. Anyone can exploit fear, anger, frustration, or uncertainty. Human beings are remarkably easy to activate. What is much harder is helping people remain thoughtful while they're activated. What is much harder is helping people remain human while they're hurting. What is much harder is helping people pursue accountability without becoming consumed by vengeance. That requires an entirely different kind of leadership. It requires leaders who are capable of seeing beyond the immediate moment and into the second and third order consequences that others may not yet recognize. It requires leaders who understand that every message influences real people, that every movement affects real communities, and that every action creates outcomes that cannot be undone. And when I look at the public response to the Carmelo Anthony case, I see people who care deeply about justice. When I look at the conflict unfolding between Israel and Iran, I see people who care deeply about safety, survival, sovereignty, and human suffering. The emotions themselves are not the problem. In many ways, those emotions are evidence of our humanity. The question is, what do we do with them? Do we allow those emotions to eliminate the path forward, or do we allow them to consume everything in their path? Because there is a profound difference between a fire that provides light and a fire that destroys a forest. The older I get, the more convinced I become that leadership is not measured by a person's ability to ignite passion. Passion's abundant. Outrage is abundant. Anger and fear are abundant. What is rare is wisdom, restraint, and the willingness to carry responsibility for the consequences of your influence. Anybody can pick up a match. Leadership begins when we recognize that we are responsible for the fire that follows. The question is really whether we're paying attention. The people in the middle. There's something that happens when you spend enough years working in trauma, crisis, disasters, critical incidents, and recovery. Your perception changes. Not all at once, not dramatically. It happens slowly over time as experience accumulates. Call after call, family after family, tragedy after tragedy. Eventually, you begin to see something that most people never have the opportunity to see. You begin to see who pays the bill. Most people experience major events from a distance. They experience them through headlines, social media posts, podcasts, news coverage, and conversations with friends. They consume information. They form opinions. They decide who they agree with and who they don't. Then eventually another story takes over the news cycle and attention shifts somewhere else. The people living through the event don't get that luxury. They wake up the next morning still carrying it, and the next morning, and the morning after that. And one of the reasons I've become increasingly cautious about certainty is because I've spent too much time sitting with people whose lives have been permanently altered by events that the rest of the world was discussing casually. I've sat across from parents trying to understand the loss of a child. I've worked with survivors attempting to rebuild a life after unimaginable trauma. I've stood beside families whose worlds were shattered in a single moment and watched them try to find their footing again. I've responded to disasters where entire communities were trying to answer the same impossible question: how do we move forward from here? And those experiences leave fingerprints on you. They change the way you listen. They change the way you speak. They change the way you think about justice. They change the way you think about leadership. Because eventually you realize that most public conversations are missing the same thing: the people in the middle, the people who don't have a microphone, the people who aren't being interviewed, the people who aren't building a platform, leading a movement, writing headlines, or appearing on television. The people who simply have to live with the consequences. And when I look at the Carmelo Anthony case, I don't just see a trial. I see families, grief, fear, confusion, a young life that is gone, and a community trying to make sense of something that can't be undone. I see parents carrying a burden that no parent should ever have to carry. I see classmates, teachers, friends, and neighbors who will remember these events long after the public has moved on to the next story. And when I look at the conflict between Israel and Iran, I see the same thing on a much larger scale. Yes, there are governments. Yes, there are military strategies. Yes, there's political interests. But underneath all of that are ordinary human beings trying to survive. Parents trying to protect their children. Families wondering if their loved ones will come home. Young people inheriting conflicts they didn't create. Communities carrying the weight of decisions made far above their heads. The scale may be different. The humanity isn't. And one of the things that concerns me most about our current culture is how quickly people become symbols. The moment we stop seeing human beings and start seeing talking points, we're moving into dangerous territory. The moment people become statistics instead of sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, husbands and wives, friends and neighbors, our capacity for empathy shrinks. And when empathy shrinks, almost anything becomes justifiable. We've seen this throughout history. We've learned that lesson over and over again. The greatest failures of leadership rarely begin with violence. They begin with dehumanization. They begin when people stop seeing each other as human. They begin when ideology becomes more important than compassion. When certainty becomes more important than curiosity. When winning becomes more important than understanding. And as a trauma practitioner, one of the things I teach constantly is the ability to hold multiple truths at the same time. To pursue accountability without abandoning humanity. To pursue justice without abandoning compassion. To recognize harm without losing sight of the human being standing in front of us. That balancing act is never weakness. It's one of the highest forms of strength. Anyone can become hardened. Anyone can become cynical. Anyone can retreat into their tribe and convince themselves that only one side deserves empathy. What takes real courage is remaining human in the presence of conflict. What takes courage is remembering that the person on the other side of the argument is still a person. What takes courage is refusing to allow outrage to rob you of your humanity. Because at the end of the day, leadership is not about winning arguments. It's not about gaining followers. It's not about proving that we're right. Leadership exists to serve people, real people, people who are grieving, people who are struggling, people who are afraid, people who are trying to build a life, raise a family, contribute to their community, and make it through another day. Those are the people who ultimately carry the consequences of our decisions. Those are the people who live with the outcomes of our leadership. Those are the people standing in the middle of every conflict, every crisis, every disaster, and every movement. And if we lose sight of them, then we've lost sight of the very reason that leadership exists at all. I won't be silenced, but I also won't be rushed. As we close this conversation, I want to return to where we began. I will not be silenced. It's a phrase we hear everywhere today. We hear it in protests on social media from activists, politicians, commentators, influencers, and ordinary citizens who feel called to speak into the challenges facing our communities and our world. In many ways, I understand the sentiment. There are moments in history when silence is complicity. There are moments when courage requires speaking. There are moments when difficult truths must be voiced, uncomfortable conversations must be had, and harmful systems must be challenged. Progress has always depended on people willing to stand up and say what others were afraid to say. But there's another side to that. The responsibility that receives far less attention. Just because we have a microphone doesn't mean we've earned the right to use it carelessly. Just because we have influence doesn't mean we're free from accountability. Just because we feel strongly doesn't mean we understand fully. And just because we're certain doesn't mean we're right. And over the course of this conversation, we've explored what happens when outrage begins to feel like certainty. We've explored the difference between justice and vengeance, the responsibility that accompanies influence, the danger of following the loudest voices, and the importance of remembering the people standing in the middle of every conflict. Because beneath all those lessons is a single question. What kind of leader will you choose to be? Not when life is easy or when everyone agrees. Not when the answers are obvious. What kind of leader will you be when emotions are high, information is incomplete, and everyone around you is demanding certainty? Will you rush to judgment? Will you attach yourself to a narrative before the facts are known? Will you allow your tribe to do your thinking for you? Or will you have the discipline to slow down, investigate, ask questions, and remain open to truth wherever it leads? Because leadership isn't measured by how quickly we choose a side. Leadership is measured by our willingness to pursue truth, even when that pursuit is uncomfortable. And the older I get, the less interested I become in leaders who always have the answers. I'm far more interested in leaders who ask better questions. I'm far more interested in leaders who possess the humility to admit what they don't know. I'm far more interested in leaders who understand that every public statement, every call to action, every movement, every decision, and every use of influence carries consequences that extend far beyond this moment. The microphone is bloodstained because leadership is consequential. Every word we speak lands somewhere. Every message influences someone. Every movement impacts lives, the lives of real people. And those people deserve more from us than impulsive reactions and emotional certainty. They deserve discipline. They deserve integrity. They deserve leaders who are willing to do the hard work of separating facts from feelings, feelings from assumptions, assumptions from evidence, and evidence from ideology. They deserve leaders who understand that accountability and compassion can coexist, that justice and humanity can coexist, that courage and humility can coexist. And perhaps most importantly, they deserve leaders who understand that truth does not belong to a political party, a movement, a nation, an ideology, or a social media platform. Truth belongs to no tribe. Our responsibility is not to manufacture it. Our responsibility is to seek it. And that pursuit requires characteristics that are increasingly rare in our modern world. Patience, humility, discipline, the willingness to be wrong, the willingness to learn, the willingness to remain human while everyone else is demanding that we become tribal. So no, I won't be silenced, but neither will I be rushed. I will not surrender critical thinking in exchange for belonging. I will not abandon curiosity in exchange for certainty. I won't trade truth for popularity. I won't trade integrity for influence. And I will never allow the urgency of a moment to convince me that wisdom is weakness, because I've seen what happens when leaders fail. I have stood boots on the ground in disaster zones. I've searched for the missing. I've worked with survivors. I've sat with the grieving families. I've witnessed the aftermath of decisions made by people who never stopped long enough to consider the consequences. And those experiences have taught me that more than anything else, truth matters. Not the convenient truth, not the comfortable truth, not your tribal truth, the truth. Because every decision made without it eventually creates another victim. And the future of our communities, our organizations, our families, and our world will not be determined by the loudest voices. It will be determined by those willing to carry the burden of leadership with integrity. So before you pick up the microphone, before you share the post, before you join the crowd, before you choose a side, before you amplify a narrative. Pause long enough to ask yourself a simple question. Am I contributing to clarity, or am I contributing to chaos? The answer to that question may tell you everything you need to know about the kind of leader you are becoming. My name is Dr. Krista Fee, and I'm the Executive Director of RISEUP Phoenix Trauma and Crisis Institute and the 501c3 nonprofit Battle to Be. I spend my days in the trenches of crisis, trauma, disaster response, recovery, leadership development, and human transformation. I've seen the very best and the very worst of what leadership can create. And I remain convinced that our greatest responsibility is not simply to speak. It's to speak with wisdom, to lead with integrity, and to pursue truth wherever it leads. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, stay curious, stay courageous, and remember, the strongest leaders are not the ones who speak first. They're the ones who care to get it right in the first place.
Become a RISEUP Hero sponsor to provide mental wellness and crisis response resources for those who serve country and community. Join us in the RISEUP movement today.